mic check, please.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the Ducks Unlimited podcast. I'm your host, Chris Jennings.
I'm your host, Dr. Mike Brasher.
My name is John Gordon. I'll be your host.
And I'm your host, Katie Burke.
Welcome to the Ducks Unlimited podcast, the only podcast about all things waterfowl. From hunting insights to science-based discussions about ducks, geese, and issues affecting waterfowl and wetlands conservation in North America. We bring the resource to you, the DU Podcast.
Hey everybody, welcome back. I'm your host, Mike Brasher, and we've got an update from Canada for you here. Early season update, and I'm super happy to be joined back by one of our favorite guests on this topic, Dr. Scott Stevens. And Scott, I'm going to let you tell us here in a minute where you're coming to us from. I might say parts unknown, but I think we're going to figure that out here in a second. So Scott, welcome back. It's great to have you.
Thanks, Mike. Always happy to join you guys. I am in Independence, Missouri right now, visiting some family and watching my daughter play some volleyball games this fall.
We probably would have waited until next week to do this episode if it hadn't been for our schedules kind of being out of sync. You're on some annual leave, and I'm taking annual leave starting tomorrow, going up to Alaska to chase some of the waterfowl that we all care so much about. So, we wanted to go ahead and get this taken care of today, and appreciate you sharing a few minutes out of your schedule to do this. And so let's just start with like a recap of how much hunting, how much time you've been able to spend out in the field. Thus far, we're recording this here. What is it, like October 13th, something like that?
Something like that.
Yeah. So how much time have you been able to spend out in the field thus far this year?
Yeah, I got to spend the better part of September. September was a busy month. That was a combination of my own time off to chase birds, a little bit of time with some donors, and then some more time off. So yeah, September, I got to be out there quite a bit. And once we hit October, I've done a little bit of hunting sort of locally around Stonewall in Manitoba, there where I live. So yeah, so I have a few field reports I can share.
Well, good deal. And probably what I'll do is just back up, and for people that may be tuning in for their first time, it's Dr. Scott Stevens. You're with Ducks Unlimited Canada. Your office is up there at Oak-Kamek Marsh. You're a frequent guest and share a lot of great updates from the prairies with us, both habitat-wise as well as hunting-wise, and a whole host of other things, conservation work that we're doing up there. And appreciate you being a source of valuable information and great entertainment as well, I might say. So
yeah, maybe more of the latter than the former.
Well, we'll take it all.
Okay, sounds good.
So let's go back to kind of early September. You love to go after blue wings, and I'll be honest, I can always watch your social media feed to get a gauge on how successful you're being. And the first couple of hunts that you went on, it looked to me like you didn't really even fill out the bag, or maybe you were just selective in the birds that you were taking photos of. Was it slow to start out with?
It was a little bit slow. I blame myself for that because, last year was fairly dry. I went back to a location that was good last year when we had fairly dry conditions. Water had come up. There wasn't as much of that real shallow habitat that blue wings prefer. So the first day I didn't do as well. Like two of us were hunting. I ended up killing 5 birds, limits 8, and my friend got 1. So yeah, the opening day was not as good as typically we've grown accustomed to. Now we adjusted, and I moved locations on day 2, and that was better. We shot limits of blue wings there, blue wings and a few green wings mixed in, which isn't unusual, even early. And then we pulled up stakes, moved to what had been my more traditional location to hunt blue wings. And as soon as I got down there, it's like, oh yeah, conditions are good. There were waves of blue wing teal. We shot a limit pretty quickly on the third day that I hunted there early on. My hunting partner shot a banded blue wing. So yeah, we were hunting southern Manitoba, not that far from the U.S. border. And this bird was banded in Devil's Lake, in 2020 as a juvenile bird. So
okay, evidence that there was some production in 2020. So that's a good thing.
Yep.
Haven't got any reports of banded birds from 2021 yet. No, I'm just kidding. But last year we do know it was very dry. We don't expect there to have been much production, but I'm certain there was some. But we'll get reports of that. But I do want to talk a little bit about the habitat conditions that I briefly referenced there, because that was the big topic last year. And then as we transitioned into this year, we got that great relief in the eastern Dakotas, southern Manitoba, and that's sort of that's where you're hunting. How are those wetland conditions holding up this time of year as we're going into fall? Are there areas that you've seen?
Yeah, so it was a good opportunity for me to be out in some of that country. I had not spent a ton of time out there in the spring or summer, but yeah, as I got out there in September, I was actually surprised. Maybe it was just my own expectations. Conditions were pretty good, but there were still places that, there were seasonal wetlands that had dried down. They could have had water in the spring, but they had dried back down. So, my reaction was, still kind of dry, still have dry wetlands, even in southern Manitoba. So, I would say, we had some recovery from the drought. We didn't have full recovery, and, more water, another big dose of snow would definitely help to refill some of those basins.
I've heard reports, I guess, that they run the gradient. I've talked with maybe half a dozen people, and it's everywhere from wetlands are still in really good condition to people saying, it's all dry again, or areas that never received the type of relief and precipitation that we would hope for. So it's right now it sounds like it's a mixed bag across that prairie landscape, and typically it is. It's very rare, as we've talked about numerous times, to get that entire landscape in prime wetland condition, with all the wetland basins full and a lot of ephemeral temporary wetlands. And so, we're heading into another one of those times where it's been dry in some areas recently, and they're starting to dry up, and need to always be looking for some of that beneficial rain to fall, as you described there. And we'll get reports from other people as we go into the fall. So, and you might be one of those as you get out into some other locations, but
right, yeah. So after teal season, I did spend some time in Saskatchewan, and I was kind of in Parkland, Saskatchewan, east of Saskatoon, and in that area, I was impressed. Wetland conditions were definitely improved over the previous year. They had picked up water. There were still some wetlands that were dry, but they had picked up water and things were improved. And, duck numbers were pretty good around there. I was not chasing ducks. We were hunting cranes in that area, had good success on cranes. But yeah, so as I traveled around, that area kind of exceeded my expectations a bit. And then from there, I was west of Saskatoon, hunting mostly white fronts. Conditions were okay there. Still some dry wetlands. Yeah, the white fronts were interesting. This is anecdotal, but we had a good hunt on the first day we were there. I think we shot 28 white fronts and only 3 juveniles. So it was a pretty low young to adult ratio. So I don't know if that's widespread, or, you probably have some guests who actually have data from some of those breeding areas, but at least in our experience, there were not many juveniles in the white front population.
We haven't talked with any of those folks yet. I don't know if Canadian Wildlife Service and Ray Alisoskas and his group have conducted their roadside surveys up there yet or not. I would think they have, or getting really close to it if they haven't. But I know I'll see Ray in December, and we'll be talking to somebody this afternoon who might be able to give us a bit of a read on some of the production from those Arctic colonies, but from the breeding grounds for white fronts. So we'll have to see on that. It's always interesting to hear these reports. Somebody will say, very few juveniles. Then once birds begin to accumulate down here, you get reports of a lot of juveniles being harvested. And so it's tough. It's tough to draw a confident assessment from a series of anecdotal reports, but it's fun to talk about nonetheless. And so I did want to ask you, it was really, really hot at least down here. How hot did it get up there in September? If I'm remembering correctly, we had like a heat wave, and then that I think was associated with some discussion about a potential delay in blue wing migration. Also, late production, a late production year, or maybe just an extended production year owing to a late spring and abundant precipitation. Any read on that? What were you seeing in terms of late broods or the state of the blue wing migration out of Canada?
Yeah, I definitely saw evidence of that late production. Driving around, scouting for blue wings in early September, there were still some young broods around, which, they'll be getting on the wing now. But in early September, they were still small. Were definitely not flighted birds. So saw some evidence of that. And I'm trying to recall in September, we had some warm temps, but pretty seasonal throughout September. It's just been recently that we got our first frost. So we were kind of delayed on those temps really cooling down. So that probably contributes. I mean, blue wings will migrate. We know they're migrating, as soon as they're in good enough condition to head south. They're an early migrant, but that'll definitely impact movement of other birds. So I know this week back home in southern Manitoba, we're getting cooler temps down below freezing, more seasonal temps for this time of year. So, that will start to move birds that are motivated by some of that cooler weather. But definitely saw evidence of late production for blue wings and for other species too, when I was out in September.
This is a question out of curiosity. I don't know if you'll have any solid insight on this, but if it's a generally late production year, you're shooting blue wings there in early September. Did you notice any difference in the fat content of the birds that you were harvesting? Anything stand out in that regard? Just kind of thinking, if they're not as far along, they may not have accumulated as much of their fat reserves for migration yet. It might show up in some of the birds you harvested.
Yeah, I definitely noticed that for juvenile birds. When you're shooting birds, you're shooting adult birds, especially early on in that area that I tend to hunt. There tends to be a lot of adult males that are kind of usually on the front end of the migration. They were in pretty good shape. They're not tethered by the demands of production. So, they're going and molting, once hens are incubating and those kind of things. So, adult birds tended to be in pretty good shape, and juvenile birds, were not super fat. They were probably got on the wing late. We're still accumulating some of those reserves. So, based on my observations, I would predict kind of a more protracted blue wing migration across the continent. I suspect we still have blue wings that are moving south out of Canada, even though, many of those early birds have been in places like Mexico for a month.
Yeah, I think Chris Jennings was talking with Kevin Cry about that very facet of blue wing migration, how this time of year those birds are stretched from the Canadian prairies all the way down to Mexico. And it certainly sounds like that's the case again this year. And I did hear some reports out of some of our supporters, our members up around the Great Lakes. They had a really slow, I would probably say, based on what I was hearing from them, their worst teal season ever. They just didn't get the birds. Okay. And they were asking me if I had any insight on it. And I said, I don't know. It's a late production year, an extended production year. It was hot in September. I don't know. It's sometimes birds do these things that we can't quite explain. A one-off type of anomaly is really difficult to put your finger on the cause for it. And so hopefully that was just hopefully it was just that, an anomaly, and hopefully they get birds back next year, because it's a place that does a good job with their management, but they just didn't get the birds. And they typically do pretty good. So, there's always stories like that, and can't always explain every one of them.
Yeah, it's become this has become a bit of a running joke with me and some of my other colleagues that are in the U.S. prairies. We'll joke and say another weird year.
That's right. It's always a weird observation.
Yeah, which really means, each year is kind of unique in the environmental conditions, and, past conditions set the table for that, like we've talked about on here before. So yeah, they're all pretty unique, and, you don't have many back-to-back years that are super similar in terms of, phenology of migration and environmental conditions. And, there's just so many factors that go in and influence bird movement. So it's not surprising when you step back and think about it, but yeah, when people experience such a difference year to year, it's striking.
What did you see in terms of juvenile to adult ratio? I guess in your bag and in what you harvested, let's say compared to last year, was it a pretty stark difference?
Yeah, there was definitely a difference. I mean, there were more juvenile birds around this year compared to last year. There were still juvenile birds last year, but, I would say it was much more common to see juvenile birds this year. And, that matches up with what we predicted given environmental conditions.
Did that hold true for other species? Let's say when you went into Saskatchewan, maybe had an opportunity to target some other species. Did you see good number of juveniles in your harvest out there? I've heard mixed reports from different locations, so I'm curious what you're seeing.
Yeah, we did. We didn't do a ton of duck hunting, but we definitely picked up juvenile birds. Like there was a flock of gadwall who, we removed some members of the flock and they made another pass, and I think the whole flock ended up in the bag. So that's indicative of juvenile birds and lots of production. But yeah, we had juvenile mallards, juvenile pintails. There were good numbers of pintails too, so they looked like they had pretty good production. So yeah, I think definitely signals that, as we expected, production was definitely improved this year over last year.
And I'll be a little, I don't know, I'll throw this out there. It's just based on 2 or 3 data points, kind of verbal data points. The consistent theme that I've heard among the handful of reports seems to be that there's evidence of there's evidence of pretty strong juvenile numbers for people hunting in Canada. But then I've heard some reports out of the Dakotas, not necessarily hunting-based reports, more based on observations and experiences from some of the banding crews, just a handful of banding crews. So this isn't representative of all of them, but that they struggled to get juvenile birds or struggled to capture birds at all. And kind of hard to know exactly what's going on there. I haven't talked to a whole lot of folks about that, so it's just a bit of a snapshot. But I did, the people that have hunted in Canada that I've talked to, they're seeing a fair number of juveniles, which, as you said, is consistent with our expectation, and that's a good thing. It's a little difficult to know how to square that with the observations of kind of tough sledding there in the Dakotas, at least with banding. But maybe it's not. Maybe if you got more water, the birds are spread out and still dealing with a recovering population. Maybe there's something going on there. I don't know.
Yeah, I guess the other thought that I'd offer on that front is, the time between when birds are produced and actually fledge and get on the wing and when we capture them and band them is probably the portion of the life cycle that we understand the least about movements during that time period. So, I know we see evidence of, once we band a bird, so it's on the wing and we band a bird in Devil's Lake, North Dakota, you could shoot that bird in Saskatchewan, that year. So, whether there was production in North Dakota that once birds were on the wing, they migrated north, to take advantage of good conditions in southern Manitoba or wherever they might find them. Birds are, especially ducks and geese, are just amazing in their ability to sample habitats and move across landscapes and, figure those things out. So that's what I'd offer, that there could be stuff like that going on. North Dakota could have had, hypothetically phenomenal production, but, if those birds moved around and found great conditions for stocking up on food a little bit north, might be hard to come up with juveniles once you're trying to band birds. So yeah, it's always interesting. That is a interesting time of year. I know we're getting some information on birds from some of the satellite transmitters that we have out now from that time of the year, but I would argue that's the time of the life cycle that we have the least amount of data and the poorest understanding of what really goes on.
I think you're right, Scott, and I've heard some of those same observations that we're getting from some of those studies. There's a number of those types of studies that are underway, and it's going to be really intriguing over the next few years to see those data come in, see those that information summarized, and begin to fill in that gap that you're talking about. So pretty cool stuff there. And let's see, as I want to start wrapping this up, but I guess the one thing I want to get your assessment of, to the best that you can offer it right now, how would you characterize the migration phenology this year, like kind of where it stands right now? You're starting to see, I've heard reports of geese starting to build in numbers there in the prairies, and maybe some other birds, mallards, perhaps more northern breeding birds starting to accumulate in the prairies. And I know white fronts are on their way. We've heard reports of them overhead down here around Memphis here in recent days. What's the status of the migration as you can kind of offer it right now? Yeah,
well, I can definitely provide some supporting evidence or anecdotes that, yes, over the past couple of weeks, I really saw, locally around me there in southern Manitoba, I saw Canada geese build in the area that I'm in. And, we were out, did some hunting, harvested some birds, actually shot 2 banded birds. They were both banded as young, when too young to fly, this August in Churchill, Manitoba, which, those were Canada's. Yep. So that's a primary breeding location for many of the migrant Canada geese that come through our area. Those birds will push south and probably winter here in Missouri. But evidence that those birds were kind of moving out of the Arctic and stacking in, and numbers were building there, like at Okamic Marsh, where our office is. So definitely saw evidence of that. Similar things are going on for, mallards and big ducks and things like that too. So, migration is progressing, and those kind of things are happening. Now it'll be weather dependent. As we get some of those cooler temps, that'll motivate some birds to move out. And hearkening back to our discussion about weird year, what has influenced some of that for geese and ducks too, probably in Manitoba and across the prairies, is harvest was a bit behind schedule. So still lots of grain in the field standing that the birds don't really have access to. So, farmers are busy taking that off. That's providing more food resources. So, that will influence how long the birds hang around too. So, there'll be a bunch of fields with newly harvested grain that they'll have access to that could hold birds until the temperatures start to really drop and, create impetus for them to move. So, all of those things are in the mix. But yeah, I would say overall, it seems like we're seeing an influx of birds and bird concentrations increasing in southern Canada, which they should be doing this time of the year.
And still a number of cranes around over in Saskatchewan from what you're hearing?
Yeah, it's been a while since I was over there chasing cranes, and they tend to be an early migrant, in a typical year, in a not weird year, we would expect crane numbers to be waning now and birds to be heading south. So I expect that's probably happening, especially as the temperatures begin to dip below the freezing mark. Cranes will be moving out, and things like more northern mallards and Canada geese will be moving in and setting up shop. So that's normal, I would say.
Yeah, that was the nature of my question, because this time period, mid-October, second, third week of October, is typically the time frame that we would target for our hunts to Saskatchewan, because we didn't want to be so late that we missed out on the cranes, but we didn't want to be so early that we missed out on some of those northern mallards and maybe some of the accumulating snow geese or other geese from the Arctic colonies. And so but it's a gamble, especially on the cranes, because if you get a strong cold snap in early October, those birds are going to skedaddle out of the prairies. And so it certainly sounds like you're probably not dealing with a super early year in terms of cold weather, especially if you just got your first frost here recently. So yeah, about normal, maybe.
Yeah. Yeah, it is interesting. You do kind of have to pick and choose. I'll admit I haven't really hunted mallards in earnest yet because they're, just beginning to get fully colored up there in southern part of prairie Canada. So, I have more interest in chasing the birds once they're plumed up, and I can, it's easy to select drakes and those kind of things. I've shot a few birds, but they were still working on that molt and growing in their plumage to look like we expect them to look once they arrive on wintering areas. So you kind of have to choose if you want to shoot early migrants. You can shoot cranes. Even things like canvasbacks tend to be an early migrant in our part of the world, and they'll be moving out. Their numbers are probably waning now, kind of like the cranes. So depending on what species you're really after, that influences timing of when you go and when you focus on them.
Scott, I think that's probably a good place to wrap it up. I appreciate you taking some time out of your annual leave, your vacation, and pass along my thanks to your family for allowing you to spend a few minutes with us here. I'll let you get back to your vacation and hope y'all have a great rest of the week. And once you get back to Canada, get back out in the field, collect some more data for us, and we'll check in probably sometime in November. Whenever we finally get that strong cold snap that we hope is going to come through and really changes things on the landscape, we'll get back in touch with you and see how things are at that point. Sound okay?
Yep, that sounds good.
A very special thanks to our guest on today's episode, Dr. Scott Stevens. As always, we appreciate the insight that he brings to us from the Canadian prairies this time of year. We thank our producer, Chris Isaac, for the great job he does on these episodes, and we thank you, the listener, for joining us and for your support of wetlands and waterfowl conservation.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the DU Podcast. Be sure to rate, review, and subscribe to the show, and visit www.ducks.org/DU Podcast for resources based on today's topics, as well as access to more episodes. Opinions expressed by guests do not necessarily reflect those of Ducks Unlimited. Until next time, stay tuned to the ducks. Stay tuned to the ducks. Stay tuned to the ducks.